Welcome, everyone. I'm Mark Duggan, the Trione Director of CEPR, the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and I'm very happy that you're able to join us. Our conversation today is going to be about getting back to school in a world that's been changed so dramatically by the coronavirus pandemic. We can't really have that conversation without first touching on the events of this past week that have reminded us of the systemic racism in many of America's institutions and the disparities that they've amplified. I'm anguished, as we all should be, by the senseless killing of George Floyd last week and of so many other African Americans in the past. As economists and as educators, we have a responsibility to help improve the systems that are failing so many people in America. The COVID-19 crisis has certainly revealed many disparities in public education in particular. One quick example is to just look at the divide between the students who have easy and seamless access to the computers they need for distance learning and those who can't even get online. So as we talk today about what school and learning is going to look like as we deal with the coronavirus pandemic, we'll be focusing on what policies and practices can help ensure equitable and efficient reopenings and how we can do more to make sure that equity and efficiency persists. I'd like to thank the Stanford Graduate School of Education and PACE, Policy Analysis for California Education, for co-sponsoring today's event. The Learning Policy Institute is also one of our co-sponsors, and many of the GSE's faculty play key roles in that organization. And it's really been wonderful that so many people have been tuning into our virtual events in the past few months. I really appreciate your support of the research we're continuing to do at CEPR and the events that we're bringing to you. Our goal is to share the scholarship and our researchers' insights with a broad audience, and I'm deeply grateful that you're all helping us make that happen. This event today is a terrific opportunity to share with you some of the strongest voices committed to improving our education system. Linda Darling-Hammond, Kyla Johnson-Trammell, and Eric Hanushek have devoted themselves to improving education policies, and I'm incredibly grateful they're joining us as panelists today. Heather Huff will be moderating the Q&A, and she'll introduce Linda, Kyla, and Eric more fully in just a minute. Heather is the Executive Director of Policy Analysis for California Education, which is an independent, nonpartisan research center based at Stanford. Heather's work has focused on using research to strengthen state structures supporting continuous improvement and to advance policies that support the whole child. Heather has an enormous amount of experience in improving education policies and practices throughout her career, and I'm really grateful she's here with us. If you've registered for this event, you'll be able to submit a question through the link you receive in your confirmation email. And if you're just joining us without having registered, you can submit questions through the link listed below this video. So thanks so much again for being with us. And with that, I'm delighted to turn things over to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thanks to the panelists for joining and to all the participants who are on as well. Just to echo some of Mark's comments, these are truly unprecedented times. As all folks on the phone, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a policymaker, or a citizen, you know that the school closures have dramatically impacted the context in which children learn and the context in which families operate. And so there are many questions as most schools are ending now and we head into the summer, many unknowns about what the fall might hold. And those unknowns bring a lot of uncertainty and a lot of stress to families across the state and across the country in the midst of what is now an economic crisis, a health crisis, and a social justice crisis as well. So, to try to shed some light on what some of the key considerations are as we look toward the fall, thinking about what it will take for schools to safely reopen and what types of policies and practices need to be in place to ensure not only that students remain safe physically and from a health perspective, but also that they keep learning, even as context for schooling might look very different than it did in the past. So our three panelists will shed light on different aspects of the considerations heading into the months ahead. And our first panelist that I would like to introduce is Kyla Johnson-Trammell, who's the superintendent of Oakland Unified School District. Kyla, can you talk with us just a bit about what is the current context in Oakland Unified, the types of challenges you've encountered thus far, and what you're considering looking toward the summer and then into the fall?
Thank you, Heather, and good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Kyla, and I am serving as a superintendent in Oakland Unified School District. And to begin to answer that question, I think it helps to just paint a picture of, the demographics and who represents the student population in Oakland. So we are about 49,000 students. We are about 2/3 district traditional public schools and 1/3 charter public schools. We serve about 77% of our students qualify for free and reduced lunch. About 67% of our students are both African American and Latinx. We have about 3,000 students that are newcomers, about 1,000 students that are unhoused, and about half of our students speak a language at home where their first language is not English. And so I say all of that just to paint a picture of great diversity in our district and in our city, which is a beautiful strength. And I think it creates the conditions for a really robust and rich public education. However, in the midst of a pandemic, you can imagine and already begin to visualize just the great and stark inequities and how they play out from some of our more affluent aspects of the ecosystem to some of our most vulnerable populations. So for a specific example, I have some elementary schools where up to 80 to 90% of our parents have been unemployed since the pandemic has started. And so when you think about the impact to a family that may be trying to have learning as the priority, but is literally day to day trying to make sure that there is food in the house, that their basic needs are taken care of, the level of trauma, the level of uncertainty, stress, anxiety, it is paramount. It's exponentially concentrated in some of our schools. And so as we've been all thrust into figuring out what is the new normal for our district and many urban districts, there have been three big things. And one has been ensuring that we are continuing to provide food for our students. As of last week, we've distributed over 2 million meals to students and families, and the level of food insecurity in our country, and particularly we're seeing in Oakland, is high. And so we're seeing a huge need for that, and we are ramping up actually continuing that over the summertime. Two is just access to devices. Just last week, we had a reflection for our distance learning among our teacher leaders. And a couple of teachers really spoke about how concerned they were the first 2 to 3 weeks, just being able to see how many students didn't have access to a device or Wi-Fi, and just the clear lack of access to be able to connect with those students and families. And so that became a number one priority, even with our extremely limited resources, trying to think creatively, what are the immediate ways, while that's definitely a policy consideration that I think we're all seeing the need to handle urgently, but on the ground immediately, how do we get as many devices into the homes of students and families as possible? And I can speak a little bit about that later. And then lastly, just setting up basic infrastructure and conditions around teachers to provide virtual learning, which I think is going to be here to stay even beyond this moment in crisis, but really beginning to get feedback and data real time from teachers around the supports that they need so that we can improve the quality of distance learning. So those three things I definitely would want to lift up is the food, devices, and just the support for teachers around providing quality learning in a virtual environment.
Thank you so much, Kyla. And well, I'm sure as a group, once our audience questions start coming in the audience panel Q&A, we'll dig into some of those considerations and the circumstance in Oakland. Thank you so much. Next, I would like to invite our second panelist, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond, to provide some comments about the current context. Dr. Darling-Hammond is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute, the Charles E. DeCommon Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University, and also the current president of the State Board of Education here in California. So, Linda, it would be really great if you could provide for our listeners today some oversight into how we should be thinking about school reopening in the fall from a tactical perspective, but also how should schools be reinvented as well as restarted?
Well, thanks for that important question. I do want to start by recognizing the protests that are going on across our country right now against the structural racism that undergirded the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and that also undergird the stark inequalities that have long plagued our economic and educational systems, as Kyla was just talking about. Until about 5 years ago, Oakland received less money on average than the average California school district. We were way behind other states in the nation. We are the most segregated state in the nation right now in terms of schools for Latinx students, and the second most segregated state in the nation in terms of schools for African American students. And so when we think about, what does it mean to reinvent schools in California and to restart them, there are a couple of realities. One is that we need to reinvent them in a way that continues the march to greater equity that was begun with the local control funding formula, but that we are in danger of losing momentum towards in this moment of heightened inequality. There's been a moment where people have sort of said, oh my gosh, there's all of this inequality around the digital divide, but of course that's been around for decades. It's just that the impact of it has become much more obvious. And to be completely transparent, the question about how we restart schools in California is going to have a great deal to do with what happens in Washington, D.C. over the next couple of weeks as the HEROES Act makes its way to the Senate, because there's been very little allocation of funds in the trillions of dollars of recovery packages to education, far less than 1% in the CARES Act, and a modest amount only in the HEROES Act if it even gets enacted. And that's going to have a huge impact, because to start schools safely and to go back physically to school, we're going to need the kind of personal protective equipment, the kind of social distancing that's needed to keep people safe, along with the testing and tracking of the virus that is going to be needed. I would say that the number one issue is closing the digital divide, for all the reasons that others have already said in terms of education, not only because we're going to be in and out of school, we're going to be in various kinds of blended learning that are necessary, both because the virus will likely recur, but also because there'll be kids and teachers who need to stay home for periods of time and self-quarantine, so that we, manage the potential for reinfection. And also because as we're trying to grapple with this digital divide, and we've probably closed it by more than half in California. We've been working hard on it over these last couple of months, but we still have probably as many as 500,000 kids and families without connectivity. And that has to be done for the rest of reinvention and restarting to occur smoothly. And so I'd say that's priority number one. I'm fairly confident that our legislature and our governor will find a way to do that. And then I think the other part of sort of a reinvention is using the skills that teachers and kids have been acquiring to engage with technology, and many more people are much more proficient than they were a little while ago, to rethink the way in which we do school in the classroom generally, to use technologies for inquiry and research in powerful ways that drive a curriculum that is really much more productive of the kind of skills kids will need in the 21st century economy than the old sit and get transmission curriculum that still has gone on in a lot of places. I'll just mention a couple of other things. It's going to be very important for us to continue the progress we're making towards embedding social and emotional learning and trauma-informed practice into the practice of all teachers. It's been amazing to me the many ways in which educators have found, even with this distancing, that we have to infuse social and emotional supports for kids. Some of the most successful schools in doing this have been community schools as well, which have ways to integrate health and mental health resources, to organize those resources for kids and families in a very integrated way, rather than asking people to go off and battle with 15 bureaucracies to try to get the services that they need, and to integrate that also in a kind of community-based approach to schooling. Kyla and others in Oakland have been doing this kind of work, and you see the strong supports that those schools are able to provide. So I think we need to be moving in that direction as well. And then we need to be really making the educational process as authentic as possible. The teachers who are succeeding right now in distance learning are those who are linking what's going on now to what kids are experiencing, and linking the learning, whether it's in math or science or social studies, to those authentic experiences, giving kids the opportunity to demonstrate what they're learning, not only to the teacher, but also to do, call up grandma or auntie or uncle and have an audience for their learning, as well as to, engage in defending their work in, their classroom and Zoom room, as it often is these days. So there's been a lot of innovation in a short period of time. And while there's huge inequality, we need to capture the innovation and build on that in this next wave of reinvention of schools.
Thank you so much for that, Linda. And there's certainly plenty of things I know we'll dig into. Again, a reminder to the audience to propose questions to the panel for when we get to the audience Q&A. I would like to introduce our next panelist, Eric Hanushek, who's the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And what we would like for you to talk about for our audience, Eric, is some of the broader context around what we might expect as a result of COVID-19 and school closures. You've studied for many years the impact of education on future outcomes, accountability, and we'd just love to hear your thoughts about what we should expect as a result of this disruption.
Thank you for the introduction, Heather, and thanks to the other panelists who have brought up some of the really serious issues. With COVID-19, what we've seen is that everybody is rightfully concerned about the current unemployment situation. How do we get people back to work in a socially acceptable and safe way, and so forth? And very little attention has been given to education in general, other than do we have schools or not? This is a problem. this generation, the cohort that's currently in schools today, will, according to history, suffer 3 to 6% loss of future income over their entire lifetime. That is a number that takes into account that we get schools back to go running immediately in the fall. If we don't get them back to running, the losses are going to be much larger. So this cohort is going to be injured just by this whole thing. We've pointed out the discrepancies and achievement gaps and problems of inequities that we've had for a long time. What was left out of that is that it's not just an immediate problem, it's a long-run problem. For 50 years, we've had an achievement gap between the better off middle income parents and their kids and the lower income families, an achievement gap that hasn't moved in 50 years. So what that means to me is that we potentially could use this crisis to really strike at the inequities that exist in California and elsewhere in the country. One idea that is an obvious one is possibly moving more quickly to a mastery learning situation, where instead of everybody sitting in the same class and learning presumably at the same pace, we put the attention more on the individual child and where they're at and what they're learning and how they progress. Now, one of the things that's been left out of the discussion to date is that we've lost essentially all information about where kids are today in schools. We've suspended in every state of the union the standardized testing of students that goes on in the spring. There's some rumbling that you hear that people would like to use this as a more permanent event where we eliminate testing and accountability in the longer run, which would be an absolute disaster. It would be a disaster, particularly for disadvantaged kids in this country. Their only hope has come through shining a light on the disadvantages that they faced. And so we have to get back to a situation where we, in fact, can measure where we're at and try to use that to leverage improvement. The one final thing that I'd actually like Kyla to speak to, there's been a lot of suggestions that a number of teachers may not, in fact, want to return to the classroom given the current risky health situation. If, in fact, we have large numbers of teachers that are unwilling to go back, then we may have a serious problem of recruiting and hiring and placing teachers in classrooms in the fall. And that brings up, the final sort of, in my mind, the final wild card is how the teachers' unions, in fact, respond to the need to change what we're doing in schools. There are mixed reactions in the press from officials in the teachers' unions about whether this is just a great time to push bargaining in various ways to get things that they want to have done. And in fact, it's going to take everybody, and importantly, the teachers, to be on board with improving our schools and dealing with the inequities that have been created here.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. So I would like to invite all of the panelists back onto the screen. And a reminder to those that are watching this live or tuned in, if you click on the link underneath the video, there you can submit your questions. So please keep your questions coming in, and I, as the moderator, will have as many of those raised up to our panelists as I can. But a number of the questions that have come in so far are really nuts and bolts questions. And so I'd like to direct some of these to you first, Kyla, to share with the audience just how you're thinking about solving for the logistical problems or challenges in the fall. So Rick highlighted the issue of some teachers not being able to return to school. There's also the issue of some students being medically fragile or vulnerable and not being able to return to school. I know that I've read many things in the news about various scenarios that are being raised, and all of them have complicated downstream effects and logistical considerations. So can you just share with our audience how you and your leadership team and your principals are trying to think about how to solve for that?
Sure. So one of the first kind of pieces in terms of mindset that I've talked about over and over again is that we're actually planning for conditions that will continue to shift. And so as we think about the logistics and as we think about the nuts and bolts, what I've seen is that's been the hardest for folks to grasp because it's really requiring folks to lean into their adaptive leadership. And the fact that we have to get a bit more comfortable with the unknown. So that's one. Two, early on, I articulated what I've called the 4 S's that we have to plan around. And first is science, and really leaning into what we're hearing from the health experts at the state level, but in some ways, more importantly, at the county level, because what we're seeing in terms of the virus varies. And secondly is safety, and thinking about the safety of both the adults, the safety of students, thinking about staff supports. What are the conditions that various staff members need in order to actually ensure that students can go back? And then all of that then guides the type of model that we need to have for student learning. So knowing that, one of the things that I've said coming up the gate is that we actually have to plan for both virtual distance learning and some form of blended learning. We have to do both. I've gotten a lot of, we just had a town hall meeting last night. We need to decide today. Sure, we could decide today that we're going to start with blended learning, but by the time school starts, that could very well change. And so we actually need to plan for both, and that gets back to the nimbleness and being ready to pivot, knowing people have a clear idea of what models would look like that are going to vary when we think about our early childhood, when we think about elementary, and when we think about secondary. Kind of the learning development comes into play. From some of the informal feedback we're getting, there's definitely a higher priority, the younger students are, to make sure that we are having more opportunities, if science says that it's okay, to have those students have more frequent contacts. We're talking about how we're defining the most vulnerable students, whether we're talking about the medically fragile, moderate to severe in terms of disabilities, students who are already 2 years or more below, in terms of being able to have more contact. And so in order to kind of get to the nuts and bolts, we've created a COVID action team around various pillars, ranging from learning to wellness, technology, finance, operations, and community. And we have leads for each of those subgroups. And so we had a town hall meeting last night. We're using Thought Exchange as a technical tool. And what I found is right now, because of the uncertainty, it's important just for people to be able to hear. We have lots of parents and teachers, and people have a lot of what ifs from, I am on, I'm in my 50s, I'm in my 60s, I have some medical issues, to, I'm a teacher and I have children. So if there isn't a place for me to send my kids, what am I going to do? To be able to get some of it is anxiety and some of it is real live dilemmas. so that these groups can then think through all of the scenarios. I've also been pretty clear that one of our realistic constraints are finances. And we need the second, third, fourth ongoing rounds of federal funding. And because the piece right now that we know we're going to need more than ever is supports around the wellness for students, but also for staff who are going to be providing safe havens during this time. That comes at a cost. But right now we have to plan around what we know we have, not what we hope we have. And so as people are dreaming, they can begin to take the vision of the model that they want. And then you bring that down into the constraints. What does it really look like when I'm looking at a 10% reduction in my funding? And we're wrestling with, we've been able to have a community school model largely because of philanthropic support. There have been times that some of our funders have said, you know, we may need a couple of more months before we know for sure we're still going to be able to give that support to you for next year or the years after that. And so part of these task force and these plannings is helping everyone understand. Yes, we're looking at the learning environment, but we need everybody to have a sense of, we have to plan looking at everything, the buildings, the flow of kids in and out of the buildings, what's going to be the model. Are we having temperature checks for every student when they come in? Who is going to do that? And even in terms of safety, the PPE is one piece of it. But also parents in the town hall brought up the great point of, what about those transition years? If my kid is coming in as a kindergartner, in the normal setting, you'd have all of these kindergarten orientations. What could that possibly look like in a virtual setting? If my kid is leaving middle school and going to high school. So those become some of the questions that probably at the central level, that may not be the first thing that someone's thinking to plan around, but that's absolutely number one as a parent, as you're thinking about how you're going to navigate and prepare your student. So again, we're planning for both, but really using this process to really lift up kind of key points of consideration and hoping to kind of have our first stake in the ground in early July.
Thanks so much.
Just add a thought if I could. We did a study at Learning Policy Institute about international back to school strategies and what has gone on in about 5 countries that have had schools reopened. Interestingly, most of them have not included high school students yet. They started with elementary school students, brought them back to school because they're typically, at least in Norway and Denmark, socially distanced. They need more classroom space than they would otherwise. And so they've used other classrooms to make that possible. And they've continued high school kids in distance learning for the most part. So just to reinforce what Kyla was saying, those are some of the kinds of things people have to think about who can, manage distance learning. It may be that teachers who are medically fragile need the ones who are continuing with distance learning and continue to get the professional development to be good distance learning teachers because that's the way in which they can contribute. And or they may be, mentoring beginning teachers, online in some ways and helping them, do more of this work. Finally, on the finances, which are just really stark. We had hoped, I think many people had hoped that the Senate would have acted on the HEROES Act by now, and that we'd be able to then tell districts, yes, you can go ahead and do your planning, right? But with the 10% drop in revenues in the state, what we thought about a month ago was that maybe states would cut budgets by about 5 or 10%. It's now looking like it's more like 10 to 15% in a lot of states because the economic drop from, sort of the shutdown. And we thought that next year, when the revenues, don't come in from this period of time, the cuts would be about 20, 25%. Now we're hearing estimates of 25 to 30%. So the bottom is dropping out. Education is 40 to 50% of most state budgets. So it is the biggest, source of funding for all the other needs that are coming up. And so the situation in terms of having a long-term capacity to look ahead. School districts can't sort of say, gee, on July 31st, the state has finally given us a budget. We're going to open on August 15th. That's like impossible to do. You have to have contracts for a full year. You've got to plan way in advance. So I think, part of what is likely is that if we don't get indications about the federal funding soon, a lot of districts are going to reopen substantially in distance learning mode because it's the only safe thing they can plan ahead to do, or they'll do that for, high school and maybe move, get the little kids back to school to the extent that is possible. But the speed with which the federal government acts is going to determine the planning time and the capacity of school districts to, determine how much they can physically open, in addition to the health conditions.
Thank you so much, Linda. My next set of questions is for you, Rick. And it's really a question of governance. And this is about, there's some speculation that I think our audience would like you to make. But some folks are saying, we're seeing charter schools perhaps moving ahead more quickly with distance learning, or private schools faster than traditional public schools. What might explain that? And is that a real or a perceived phenomenon in your perspective?
Well, I think on average it's true, but it's not true in every instance. What we've seen is there are some charter schools that have done amazing jobs, even providing the food to the public school kids that Kyla was talking about before. But then there's some charter schools that have not done well at all. And similarly with public schools, some public schools in some districts have been very nimble in the terms that we've used here, and others have been horrible in terms of denying education to poor kids or to the district on the argument that there is some inequities that are involved because of the lack of devices for everybody. So that I think it's been very hit and miss on which districts and which charter schools and which private schools have done well and which have not. And so there's no real generalization that I see at this point.
Linda?
One thing that I will say is that charters in California have traditionally had less constraint on things like the counting of instructional minutes and things like that. And we have waived the counting of instructional minutes and seat time during the spring. But it's very important for public school districts that the flexibility around the way in which we think about instructional minutes, seat time, average daily attendance, and so on, be worked through and continued for all schools, because that kind of the old model that we're working off of and what's in regulation around how you count instructional minutes and what seat time means and so on, is being broken up as we speak. I mean, that is being completely disrupted, and it needs to be disrupted for us to do these flexible models that Kyla was talking about. So that is something that where our regulation of the entire public school system needs to be rethought. And we are deeply involved in thinking about what that will need to be in the very, very near future.
Mm-hmm. So we did have a lot of questions along that line as well. And Linda, maybe you can talk about this first, and then Kyla, we'd love your perspective too. But what is the appropriate state role now in navigating these challenges with, on one hand, districts having very different contexts and needing flexibility, but on the other hand, as a lot of our questions indicate, people are seeing really wide variation in terms of the quality of services that students are getting during this time. So how do we balance that need for flexibility with that need for performance and quality oversight?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a really good question, and it's one that everybody is asking. We're deep in conversations about that with the legislature at the state board and the Department of Education and in the governor's office. We, on the one hand, our initial role was getting rid of regulations that were in the way for people to just, get going, and to then assembling resources, which we did very early on. California might have been one of the first states to really assemble distance learning resources and professional development and so on, and just really to try to move that forward. And a lot of other states used our guidance as guidance for their guidance in that regard. We've been a local control state. That's been kind of our framework. Subsidiarity has been the watchword, for a number of years. Whatever can be decided locally should be decided locally, with support and reinforcement from the state. But there is a lot of question about what are the parameters, around distance learning. What is enough? It's not going to be seat time and the old instructional minutes ways of calculating, but what does quality distance learning consist of? What kind of interactions should be anticipated between and among adults and kids? How do you wrap around with those other services? So we are engaged in learning from the wonderful work that's going on in a lot of districts across the state and developing guidance around these questions. And we're going to have to rethink. It's not that there are kids going completely uneducated right now because they've disappeared from the system and they're hard to find. Some have left the country and gone back to countries of origin and are kind of sitting it out. Others, I know in some cities, people are, finding kids and putting hotspots in homeless shelters and a lot of other places to try to be sure the kids can be engaged and wired up, but it's been a real challenge. And then there are places that are doing a lot less than others in terms of accessing the kids. So we do need to put some parameters on it, but it's not going to be the old seat time instructional minutes parameters in the old way. We're going to have to figure out what the quality standards are for distance learning. And that is in process, and we will be working on that with districts over the coming weeks.
And Kyla, from your perspective as a local leader, how do you see what types of supports or requirements even you would like from state policy?
Yes, I still believe in just that balance of tight and loose. And I just think during this time where it's so unprecedented, there probably will be more leaning on that tight, just because particularly in large urban districts, there's a lot of getting people to re-envision what that teaching and learning space looks like. And in our district, like in many large urbans, I can point to teachers in schools where in many ways they've already used this crisis as an opportunity to push forth flexibility around staffing models, different kind of iterations of professional development, ways that they're using their after school program, and that the youth there in terms of providing mental health and really thinking about the classroom beyond the brick and mortar confines, and really seeing it could be after school, it could be in the community. And then you have various schools and communities that really need more of that guidance. I think definitely, whether we're talking about flexibility in terms of attendance, really thinking logistically around, we know kids are going to be in and out of missing days because of COVID-related illnesses, and having that not count against districts, to really being able to have some of the flexibilities that are afforded some of our charter schools, but I think more importantly, more models. Because I think that's what we're going to see, is that people are going to need to see, until the vision becomes owned and understood, what are models? What do models look like when we're saying the whole child in community schools? Because there are many ways to actually get to that particular vision. And then that's when the tight and loose comes into play. What works in one district in Northern California may not work in a rural area. Oakland has had a long history of having a lot of involved partners in our city. That's largely what's allowed us to really be able to move in the direction of community schools. Because even when funding has been tighter, we've been able to allow and lean on some of our partners. And so there are many different ways of thinking about how you braid together federal resources, state resources, local resources, what are models? I know there are lots of districts that are thinking about if the mental health pieces are going to be so pronounced. Is it advantageous to have some teachers where that becomes their subject area? And if I'm really good as a teacher in terms of providing high quality online instruction, perhaps I do all of the math for my school or all of the science. And so really being able to lift up, I think, from the field, what are the different models of how different school districts are, are attacking this? How are they working with labor? I think that's another strategy of we're all going to individually work with our labor partners, but are there some conversations that are happening at the state level? Because we're not going to be able to do what we need to do unless we're working in partnership with our labor partners. So definitely some legislation and changing and having more flexibility, but I also think lifting up from the field just some best practices, best processes to get to these new models, and just being able to say, here are some different models that we believe are going to help us continue to get to high quality teaching and learning. And last thing, I think the piece that keeps me up at night, back to the accountability, is thinking about the level of, summer slide doesn't even begin to describe what we're going to, the season we're going to go into. And so really thinking about what does high quality assessment look like when the level of diagnostic assessment and how schools, every school is going to need to be able to see how much loss did our particular students, which students they're just sailing on, some actually are going to advance, and then we know some are going to slide. I worry about that being totally left to individual districts. And I think that's just going to be a conversation around what does high quality formative assessment look like in this new era.
And one of the things that, just to piggyback on that, that is part of the guidance that's going to be coming soon, is that we, as a state, have the resources of the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, which does our summative test, which was canceled this spring. But there are interim assessments in the system that can be strategically used both to give a broad cross section of achievement and to go deep in areas of the curriculum where you want to see how kids are doing. And that's really important, because the sort of getting just a score across the board doesn't tell you nearly enough as a teacher about where the child is on a learning progression in math or in an area of reading, so that you can then figure out how to build on that. So we're going to need to help districts figure out how best to use a set of interim assessment tools and formative assessment tools that go outside of the grade level also. One of the challenges of federally mandated tests is that they've been grade level specific. And yet everybody knows that in a common classroom, you may have kids 2 or 3 levels, quote unquote, below grade level, and as much as 2 or 3 grade levels above. And if the grade level test doesn't have any questions or items on it to assess their gains, you're not really getting much of a picture of where they actually are. And we can't just teach above or below their heads. You've got to figure out where their head actually is and then really move them along. So I really appreciate Kyla's point on that we need to be we have the tools, but a lot of districts and teachers may not know how to use all of the tools that they can use to get a really strong sense of where their kids are and how to help them move forward. I hope we'll do this in a way that says to children, kids are always learning. What they're learning is all over the place, right? But every minute of every day, we are all learning as human beings. What we need to say to kids is we're going to figure out where you are in your learning in different domains and then accelerate your progress. Rather than taking a frame of reference which says we're going to label you as smart or dumb, above or below, and then put you in a class with a bunch of other people who are above or below, and then teach to the average, which is still going to miss what they need and give them a sense of stigma at the same time. So it's going to be a process of helping us help teachers figure out how to really assess where they are. Some folks are actually suggesting and some districts are looking at this. It would be complicated and not always doable, but to send kids back to the teachers they had last year first, who already know where they were in their learning, spend a quarter with those teachers. In schools that loop, it might be longer, but let them take stock of where things are, wrap around them. They know the families, they know the kids, they know how the kids learn, and then pass them on to the next teacher when they've done that diagnostic. That's, I think, another interesting idea for getting more continuity in our understanding and our analysis of where kids are in their learning, because it's really about where were you, where are you, and then how are we going to help you continue to move.
That's right. Thanks so much.
Can I pick up for a second on this?
Yeah.
I think that I couldn't agree more with Linda on this, that we have to have the tools to find out where kids are, because what we're going to see in the fall is much larger variation of where kids are in every classroom that we have and in the online circumstances. And sort of linking some of this also to what Kyla was saying about having different models. Right now, everybody is looking around for, well, how do we do this? We haven't done this before, and trying to find new ways. It's really important when we do that, that we give information on which models are working in terms of the learning of kids. And so we have to have this measurement going on and relate that to the different ways that kids are learning and the different models. And I think linking it much more closely to the specific people and sort of putting the people that are good at online work, teaching online, and putting the people that are better at in-person teaching in front of the kids that need it the most. We haven't been guiding our processes that much in the past by who's good at what different tasks. And this might be the opportunity where we can, in fact, move closer to that and take advantage of the skills, the different skills that different teachers have. But that's going to be a big jump. That's going to be a big change. And my fear is that we, in the chaos of just trying to make sure that kids know how to get into the building and whatever else we have to worry about, that we won't think about that early enough. But that's where we have to get to, I think.
And one more
Well, you have
is competency based rather than grade level specific. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation.
You got it. You got it.
We could be thinking about, when you go to the YMCA to take swimming lessons, you take your test and they tell you you're a guppy or a minnow or a shark or a dolphin. And, it doesn't matter how old you are, whatever. And then you move through the learning progression. So it's an opportunity, and some places will be able to take advantage of it if we get the resources in, so we're not at survival mode.
Mm-hmm, that's right. Rick, I want to switch gears and put to you a question that's coming up in a variety of forms about the economy. So one of the reasons why opening up schools is so important is so parents can get back to work. But as we think about who currently gets to work from home, we know that lower income people are less likely to be able to work from home. How should we be thinking about reopening schools and childcare as it relates to parent work?
Well, I'm actually of the belief that reopening the schools is not that dangerous, because the evidence that I see suggests that young kids don't get COVID-19 very frequently, and they don't have the severe problems with it. And so opening up the schools, I think, is a good thing to do. And in part for the reasons that you suggest, that we have to get the labor market back in operation. We have to get the rest of the healthcare system back in operation that hasn't been in operation because of this. And that this is going to be extraordinarily important, particularly for the most disadvantaged kids. That it's clear that people that are on hourly service jobs have suffered much more than I have sitting in front of my computer terminal since for the last 12 weeks. And so it's a matter of real urgency and of long-term care of the kids, that their parents are also able to get back to work.
Kyla, what's your perspective on this child care situation as it pertains to school reopening and all of the different models that you're considering?
I mean, it's crucial. And again, back to what I talked about in terms of the 4 S's, there's that tension there of science and safety. And I feel, and I'm using this number loosely for the sake of conversation, I'd say parents are split. There's the urgency to get back to work. And then many parents are trying to wrap their brains around the high level of concentration, and perhaps they may be themselves caring for someone who has health impairments in their own homes, and thinking about, is there going to be an increase of exposure? We do know children are also carriers. We're still learning about the virus as well. So I think that's what makes this so different and difficult. And back to the need for adaptive leadership, because we have to hold both. We know the longer kids are out of school, we're going to have exponential learning loss. We know that's going to have an impact in a negative way to the economy. And there's a safety component. And it just so happens the communities that are disproportionately impacted by the virus are the same communities that are experiencing the loss. And so that is why I think now, really every single district having those conversations with the community to try to understand the complexity of the concerns in terms of thinking through what's the best way. I've been working in conjunction with our city, because again, if we're just thinking about the classroom as schools and not thinking about, is there a role for Boys and Girls Club? Is there a role for libraries, other entities, where even if we go back, what then happens when we have to do shutdowns, right? We're still going to be going back, isn't going to be a guarantee that learning is going to be continuous in the brick and mortar setting. So we still have to have this other way of thinking about how do we do our best to ensure continuity of learning for students and continuity of employment for parents.
Thank you so much. So we only have a couple of minutes left, and with the short amount of time that we have, what I would like each of you to do in just 1 minute is to end us on a positive note. There's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of fear amongst parents, amongst workers, but many of you have also highlighted some things that you hope to see. You've highlighted that we weren't doing well in terms of educational performance for our African American or our Latinx students, for our low-income students. There's opportunity to do better. So when you think about what types of systemic change you want to see, what's your vision for when we're on the other side of this crisis, what we've done and how we've fixed our systems? And Linda, we'll start with you. 1 minute.
Well, I mean, in an ideal world where people are really alert to what's needed and investing in the right ways, we would be on the other side of this. We would have closed the digital divide. We would have, adults and kids, completely wired up and able to use technologies in very empowering ways in the curriculum, whether they're in or outside of school. We would have taken advantage of many of the innovations that have been going on as people have been developing the curriculum, and the flexibility that has enabled people to think outside the box. And we would have really made the investments in greater equity in the system, both for the academic needs of kids and for the wraparound integrated services that we've also talked about so much, so that, in every school, all of those features are there, whether it is happening in any given moment for any given child, online or in person, that those services, those digital supports, and that innovative teaching is readily available.
Thank you. Rick?
my view on the other side of the world is a reiteration of what I've been talking about, and that is we have these huge inequities in the system, and we have huge failures of not performing as well as the whole system should compared to, say, Europe, which has done much better. I would see that we try to make decisions based upon what works for individual kids, and what works in terms of the learning of children should guide whether we have blended instruction, which teachers should be in front of which kids, and which teachers should be rewarded and which shouldn't be for, in fact, the performance of kids. Because if we don't focus on the performance of kids, we will continue to have huge gaps, achievement gaps for disadvantaged kids, and our country will suffer in the long run.
Thanks. And Kyla?
On the other side of this, that we've really figured out how to systematize community schools. I do think that provides the best conditions to provide opportunities for all, whether we're talking about data sharing between different governmental agencies so that we're optimizing the resources that we have across education, across healthcare, across the city in service of our most vulnerable students and parents. We're continuing to blur the lines between these artificial places and spaces of when students are supposed to learn certain skills, and particularly in terms of high school, community colleges, and universities, for kids to be able to more fluently continuing to learn and to work, just given what we're seeing in terms of the constant and dynamic movement in the workforce, that we are creating a multilingual public school system so that we're moving away from just everything being English only. We know for our students that are bilingual, when we have quality learning in both languages, they accelerate. That is a huge advantage for all of our students. And right now it's left to some and not for all. So I could go on and on and on, but you did tell me 60 seconds.
Thank you all so much. I think we could go on all night, but I'm going to invite Mark back to close us out. But thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to the participants that were listening in. And I do highly recommend following the work of these organizations and these individuals, as there is just a lot more to learn and a constantly changing context. Mark?
Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks so much to our terrific panelists. And thanks all of you for attending today's virtual panel hosted by CEPR and co-sponsored by Stanford Graduate School of Education, Learning Policy Institute, and Policy Analysis for California Education. We appreciate your participation in this event and hope you enjoyed hearing from the presenters about K-12 education during COVID-19. Please enjoy the recording of this conversation by visiting the event page on CEPR's website. And we hope you'll stay up to date with CEPR and join us for other upcoming CEPR virtual events. Have a great night, everyone. Thanks again.